Welcome to the Roundtable Perspective. I'm your host, Tom Roach, and I'm joined today by my guest, Dr. Nicky Jackson. Dr. Jackson is an associate professor of criminal justice at Purdue University Northwest, and we're here to talk about wrongful convictions. Dr. Jackson, thank you for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
Tell us how you got involved in wrongful convictions as an area of interest.
Okay, so about 5 years ago, I read an article in a newspaper about a gentleman in Gary who had been incarcerated for 24 years for some armed robberies that he did not commit and a homicide that took place. I couldn't believe it. I've been teaching this stuff for decades, and all of a sudden, here's this story right in front of me. So I contacted the prosecutor's office and spoke to my friend and asked him if this guy was truly innocent or if he was out on a technicality, and he said this man is truly innocent. And so I wanted to meet the man, and so I reached out to
That's a little bit unusual, isn't it? Because sometimes the state's attorney's offices don't want to admit that they made a mistake, right?
Well, I would think so, but he admitted that we locked up the wrong guy.
Yeah.
And so I reached out to Mr. Donald's attorney and had breakfast with him 2 days later, and he had just been out of prison for just weeks, so this was brand new for him.
Wow.
So I made some promises to him that I was going to make some changes in the state of Indiana. One thing that I learned is that people who come out of prison in Indiana, if you're guilty, we have services for you. We have parole officers who work with you. They help you find jobs, housing, whatnot. But if you come out of prison as an innocent person, the state had absolutely nothing for you. So, so we provided nothing for these innocent folks. So I started really raising my voice and talking to a lot of senators and hosting dinners and said, listen, we need a compensation bill. And I'm really happy to announce that we do have HB 1150 now, which is a compensation bill that offers money to those who've been wrongfully convicted.
That's great. That's also a democracy works story for a change, isn't it?
It worked. It worked.
How long did that take?
Well, it took 3 years, which it was pretty fast.
Yeah.
People said that they'd been trying to get this bill for decades, and nobody was listening. And I think I just got the right people together to really listen to what these folks have gone through and what hardships that they're facing.
And you recently presented on race and wrongful convictions at Purdue Northwest's Race, Racism, and Anti-Racism series, right?
Yes, I did.
What was the issue there? What did you talk about?
Well, we actually talked about a case that was spotlighted on 48 Hours, a gentleman named Roosevelt Glenn, who had spent 17 years in prison for rape, a gang rape that he did not commit. So we had him on and we talked about African Americans and how disproportionate they are in the exonerations. In fact, the National Registry of Exonerations noted just their last report in September 2020 stated that 49% of those who've been exonerated are African American.
Yeah.
That's a lot of wrongs against the African American community.
Right. So after looking into this, what insights do you have about that?
Well, the cases that I've been working with in terms of talking and interviewing the exonerees, we do know that the African American males who've been wrongfully convicted of raping a white female, the cases have all fallen under mistaken identity. So they're being misidentified.
Well, what other things lead to wrongful convictions?
Official misconduct, police and prosecutors, not doing the right things.
Give us an example of official misconduct.
Police officers torturing folks into a confession, physical torture, mental torture, until they confess to a crime they did not commit. This happens, and Chicago has a torture agency, that Chicago Torture, I think it's called the Chicago Torture Agency, and they look at cases of folks who were wrongfully convicted based on beatings. But other areas are definitely outside of false confession, mistaken ID, faulty DNA. I mean, DNA can be a great thing and it can also be a bad thing. Sometimes DNA can actually lead to a wrongful conviction.
How can that happen?
If the procedures were not done properly, if the individual wants to make a name for himself or herself, they may fudge some of the DNA results. I've seen it in cases.
Yeah.
So it does happen. The other issue is jailhouse snitches and other people who basically lie and say this person committed this crime and they just want a deal to get out of their situation.
So they claim that somebody confessed to them and then they end up being a witness against them.
Right, and so then the state usually makes some kind of a deal with them to reduce their sentence or whatnot, and that's a real problem. That's a real big problem. So mistaken identification, official misconduct, false confessions, faulty DNA, those are really the highlights of how somebody can end up in prison.
So
wrongfully.
Obviously we're more focused on this now than we have been. Is that because this is more prevalent now, or just because it's just now coming to light?
I think it's coming to light. I don't think it's more prevalent. I think we're starting we have DNA now that's allowing us to reinvestigate these cases. We didn't have that before.
Yeah, that's interesting. I know in ancient times they considered testimony more valid if it was given under torture than if it wasn't. But
can't do that today.
What we understand today is that it's actually the opposite is true. Right?
Yeah, we are seeing too many folks, young people who were beaten into confessions. Mr. Donald's case was different. He was picked out of a photo lineup. There were five armed robberies in Gary, Indiana, in the Glen Park neighborhood of Gary, and there was a homicide of one of the victims. He was holding his child, his daughter, and the robber ended up shooting and killing Mr. Jimenez. And so anyway, Mr. Donald's picture was in a photo lineup, and people always ask, well, how did his picture get in a photo lineup if he hadn't been in trouble before? Well, what had happened is Mr. Donald, 3 years prior to these armed robberies, he had been in a vehicle driving around Gary. It was a borrowed vehicle from a friend's uncle, and the aunt called the police and said that the car had been stolen. So Mr. Donald got picked up with his friend, and make a long story short, he ends up at the police station and they take pictures of him. And these pictures from 3 years earlier end up in this photo lineup. And the witnesses...
So if I could just interrupt for a second. So they didn't put that picture in there because they thought he was a likely suspect. They just put it in to...
Random.
To have a set there so that when the person identified the actual person, that they would they have better verification because they picked it from among 5 or 6 or 10 or something.
But the problem is with these photo lineups and physical lineups is they pick people who don't look like the suspect, which, the victims all said this man had acne all over his skin.
But in this case, I mean, this just amazes me because the police officer or officers who put this picture in there knew this person had no connection with this. I mean, there's
I don't know what they
there's
knew,
how many thousands of people in the community, right? And so the chances that they randomly picked a photo that would identify the person they were looking for are pretty remote. I mean, common sense would tell you that's invalid, right?
Well, the common sense would tell me that we don't put a picture of somebody without acne. I mean, every witness said. Every victim said this perpetrator had acne. And Mr. Donald, if you look at his mugshot, nothing.
So how does he get convicted?
So he got convicted, and this is a good question. So he got convicted because there were 6 people who were asked to look at these, 2 looked at the photos and then others looked at the physical lineup. The others said, we don't see him. And one was actually a former Gary police officer. And the former Gary police officer said, nope, don't see this individual. But what happened was the Gary police had 2, from my understanding, the Gary police had 2 victims from 2 separate armed robberies. You have to understand these armed robberies took place within like an hour. All these armed robberies took place in a very short window of time. And so
it looked like somebody was going from one place to another.
And so what happened was they took 2 of the witnesses, Mr. Jimenez's fiance and another woman, Rhonda Fleming. They brought them in to look at this photo lineup, and one said, I don't see him. I don't see a picture. I can't identify him. And the other one said, well, possibly it's him. Possibly it's him. So then the other one says, well, I still don't see him. And eventually, at some point, says, okay, yeah, it could be him. It could be him. So literally, this man ends up in prison for almost 24 years.
Well, I'm sorry.
Yeah, no.
So how does this get through a trial? I'm astounded here.
Most people are, because it's hard to believe. There was no other evidence, nothing linking Mr. Donald
And
to
he had
these.
an attorney.
He did have an attorney. He did have an attorney.
And these witnesses were cross-examined, and
I don't know what happened during the trial process. All I
Yeah.
know is that
Or
a
did he
man
plead
went
out?
up,
Did he
end up,
plead out?
and no, he said from day one, I'm
Yeah.
an innocent man.
Yeah,
I
yeah.
am. In fact, he was offered an opportunity to get out of
Yeah.
prison 3 years before he
Yeah.
got out, and he said no.
yeah.
I
Well,
want-
no, the only reason I suggest that is I know sometimes they offer them deals to get out more quickly, and if they think they're going to get
Yeah,
convicted,
I don't know.
even if they're innocent, they sometimes take them, right?
I don't know, but
Yeah.
knowing Mr. Donald, I would tell you
He
that
wasn't gonna do that,
He
yeah,
was
yeah.
not going to do that. They offered him an opportunity to get
Yeah.
out 3 years earlier, and he said nope, not until everybody knows that I'm
Well,
innocent.
that's a good example of the problem.
It's a huge, the big
Yeah.
problem was the officers, when they did that photo lineup, should have used pictures, first of all, of an individual who would match the description
Right.
that the victims had given,
Right.
and unfortunately they didn't do that.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so a man lost 24 years of his life, and he's still dealing with, this will haunt him forever.
Well, yeah. I mean, part of his life's gone, right?
Everything. I mean,
Yeah.
think about it. You and I have Social Security, we have benefits. These folks that come out, they have nothing. How do you explain in a resume where you've been for 24 years?
Yeah.
How do you explain that?
Yeah.
And we don't have a certificate of innocence in the state of Indiana, so those who've been wrongfully convicted won't get the certificate that they would get in Illinois. You know, they get letters. I know the prosecutor wrote a letter stating that this man, Mr. Donald, his conviction had been vacated. But, you know, how do you explain to employers, to folks who are going to rent apartments to you, that you really are innocent?
So, as an academic who sits back and objectively studies this, what do we need to do to avoid having this happen over and over again?
Well, we need to really revamp the entire system. There has to be this overhaul. So it starts with police. You know, there has to be accountability, and I think that's what's really been missing. Nobody's held accountable for what's happened to Mr. Donald. The police officers have not been held accountable. The prosecutors in Mr. Glenn's case, they had DNA before Mr. Glenn was ever even sent to trial that showed that he was not the
Yeah,
rapist.
yeah.
So I think once we start holding those in the criminal justice field accountable, saying, you know, you have to do the right thing.
Well,
and there has to be
hypothetically,
ethics.
how would we hold them accountable?
Well, I think that's a good question. So for police, if they intentionally
Right.
do something inappropriate that can result in a wrongful conviction, first and foremost, they should be removed from their position. That's without question. There should be sanctions involved. You know, how do we punish innocent people and we
Yeah.
lock them up? So we should have some kind of sanctions for those.
Well, yeah,
in
there
the
would
system.
be a penalty if I, for instance, gave false testimony that got somebody convicted,
That's
right?
right,
So
right.
this would be somewhat parallel to that, right?
I would think so, and I would hope so.
If not worse.
I
right?
would hope
Yeah.
so, yeah. I would
Yeah.
hope that, I mean, we have to do something. We have to say to police, to prosecutors, listen, if you know this person is not guilty,
Yeah.
or you don't even suspect this person, they should be removed immediately.
Yeah.
All right. There was nothing that I have not talked to the police officers in Mr. Donald's case, so I don't know. Maybe they felt that there was something. But when the evidence is not there, it's not there. There was zero evidence, nothing other than the testimony of two women who were a little iffy that it was him.
Yeah, well, it seems to me something had to have gone wrong at the courthouse in addition to the problems with the investigation.
Well, I think
but,
the jury heard the testimony of these, victims and, said, yes, that's him. But you have to also remember that if you're looking at a photo lineup and then you go to a physical lineup, you're going to pick out the person you picked on the photo
Right,
lineup.
right.
I
You're
mean, it's
looking for
just,
the
it's
photo.
common sense.
Yeah, is there any research on that? I mean, if you show 10 people a set of pictures, are there some faces that people are going to gravitate to because they're more charismatic or something? Or?
There is research on there. I'm
Yeah.
not familiar with the research, but I would definitely argue that people who are darker skinned would be more likely to be picked out of a lineup, just because we definitely racially profile people.
Yeah.
I don't know what happened in Mr. Donald's case specifically that led to his photo being picked out, but they picked the wrong guy.
Yeah.
And people don't think about this, but I hope you think about this. People, when we lock up the wrong person, that means the real bad guy is still out there.
Right. Oh, yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So they believe that the actual robber in Mr. Donald's case was murdered shortly after Mr. Donald was placed in prison.
So poetic justice is still in effect.
Yeah,
right?
and we don't even know if that guy, I mean, I don't know, that's just
yeah.
the theory. But also keep in mind that in Mr. Donald's case, the prosecutors were told, they were informed by one of the witnesses that they saw this man walking on the street. They saw the robber out
Yeah.
on the street. Well, so the police go to Goldblatt's where Mr. Donald's working. They ask for the timesheet, and he's at work.
Yeah.
He's at work, so he couldn't have been the guy that they picked out,
Yeah.
but this was not introduced into trial. So there was so much omission.
Yeah, that trial's very curious to me.
Yeah, it is to a lot of folks.
So another really interesting case that I know you've looked into is Ron Cotton,
Yeah, his
and
case
you've
is-
talked to Mr. Cotton as well. Can you tell us about that one?
Yeah, so Ron Cotton is an African-American male who was wrongfully convicted of a rape of a white college student, a female college student, and he was innocent, went to prison, and I've interviewed him, I've talked to him, he's an amazing man. To make a long story short with him, he saw this man walk in to prison one day, the new inmates were coming in, and he said, I saw this guy who matched the composite photo that the victim had provided. So he saw the guy and he went up to him and he said, hey, where are you from, man? And the guy told him
This
the
is like
town.
a movie.
Yeah, oh, it is like
What
a
a
movie.
plot,
They wrote a
yeah.
book. They wrote a book,
Yeah.
so called Picking Cotton. And it was a New York Times bestseller. So anyway, Ron said, I saw this guy and he looked just like the composite. So I walked up to him and said, where are you from? And he said, this town that I'm from.
Yeah.
And so they end up chatting it up, and Ron said, I never let anybody be a pen pal with my sister, but I let this guy be a pen pal.
Yeah.
So what Ron did is he said, hey, let's get our picture taken, and I will send it to my sister. So they took a picture together, and Ron ended up sending it to his attorney,
Wow.
who took it to the victim and said,
Wow.
this is the guy. And so he actually solved his own deal.
How long
with
did
the
that
case.
take?
Well, he was incarcerated for 10 years,
Oh,
so I'm
gosh.
not really sure how long before this when the other gentleman came in. But it's a pretty amazing story. And he and the victim in the rape case have become friends. They actually wrote the book together.
Really?
And the book is about their friendship. And, in talking to Ron, he'll tell you that she was just as much a victim as he was. She didn't intentionally pick out the wrong guy, but for whatever circumstances did pick out the wrong man.
And what happens to people when they're released?
Okay, so it depends on your state. In Indiana, not much happens. They go wherever they can. Mr. Donald was fortunate that he had family. Mr. Glenn was fortunate he had family, but I've talked to exonerees who were sleeping on benches. They were homeless. I've talked to exonerees who have had the good fortune of having a celebrity back them up. Eddie Vedder picked up the Jason Baldwin case, which is part of the West. Jason was wrongfully convicted in the West Memphis 3 case. And Jason was very fortunate that when he was released from prison, Eddie Vedder took him into his home and helped him. Not everybody has an Eddie Vedder, and that's the sad part. So the state needs to take some responsibility. I'm really vocal about this. States have to right these wrongs. Some of these people don't have family. Their families have died while they're in prison. Mr. Donald didn't get to see his father's funeral, didn't get to say goodbye to his father because he was incarcerated when his father passed away. And I hear during my interviews that seemed to be one of the saddest parts for these folks, that they lost loved ones and they didn't get to say goodbye.
Yeah. One of the more famous people you've been in touch with is the college student, I think. Was she a college student?
She was a
who
college student, yep.
in Italy, and maybe you could tell us a little bit about her.
Well, Amanda, I was
yes.
I was fortunate enough to talk to Amanda Knox
Yes.
and talk about her case, and she's pretty incredible. Listening to what she endured, and so this happened in Italy, not in the United States.
Yeah.
But
Similar story, though, isn't it?
It's very similar, and that's
Yeah.
what's so sad is that people just decided that she is guilty. The police just cornered.
Everybody in the country decided she was
Because
guilty,
of her,
pretty much.
her behavior, they thought it was
Yeah.
not the right way to behave. And I don't know what the right way is to behave if you come home and you see your roommate has been raped and killed. I don't know.
Yeah, well, I know it's a bizarre story. So, now,
Especially
this is over 10 years old, right?
I would think so, yeah.
Give us the synopsis of what happened here. There were two girls living together in Italy,
Yep.
and one comes home and the other one.
So Amanda and her
Yeah.
boyfriend came home and found her roommate murdered.
Yeah.
That's pretty much the story. And her behavior after the murder was what led the police, I believe, to be suspicious of her.
Yeah.
She was young. She was, I'm guessing, around 19 when this
Yeah.
happened. I mean, she was a sophomore doing study abroad, And can you imagine?
And that's why this made international news. I mean,
Well,
it was
and what she said to me that I found to be really fascinating was that this whole trial went through and she didn't speak Italian.
Yeah.
So she didn't know what was happening. And in fact, when she went to prison, she didn't even know she was going to prison. She had no idea that she was actually going to prison.
Wow.
So yeah, these things do happen, and they happen not only here in this country, but in other countries.
So what are some training things that we could be talking about here for police, for judges, for state's attorneys? What else can be done?
I think first and foremost, we really have to go back to police work. And we have to, again, go back to the photo lineups, and we have to look at who police are using for information. And people don't really think about informants as being so important in a lot of cases, but they are. The problem with informants is, they're not the stellar part of community who are giving us the information, but that's unfortunately who the police have to rely on.
Yeah.
I get it. I understand. They're the ones who are out on the streets at night. They're the ones who are involved in behavior that would link them to this.
And and they tend, this is also true in some other professions. Journalists, for instance, you're constantly interfacing with people who are doing things that you're trying to catch them at sometimes, right? And so you get the suspicion, I'm sure, sometimes that everybody you see is hiding something, right?
Maybe.
Yeah.
I mean, I just know that the police are limited with who they can interview, but I think police have to there must be better training for questioning. I've never liked the fact that police are able to and encouraged to lie during interrogations.
How do you
have
mean?
your DNA. We have your, they can.
They're encouraged?
Yeah, I think so. I think they're encouraged. We want a confession. So just tell them we have your DNA, or so-and-so saw you, or whatever the situation may be.
Yeah.
I don't believe police should be able to lie. I don't believe, because, I mean, and I would suggest this to anybody, if you were ever picked up by the police, get an attorney. I mean, you and I, if we got picked up by the police, we would probably talk, because we'd say, they want to catch the right person and I have nothing to hide.
Yeah.
That's the biggest mistake people make. Get an attorney.
Really?
Absolutely. Have an attorney there, because I talk a lot. So for me, I probably would say something that somebody may take the wrong way. So best to have an attorney guide me and advise me on what to answer and how to answer that. But that is a big mistake for a lot of folks who say, you know what, I have nothing to hide. Nothing to hide at all.
Okay, well, I think we'll end with that advice.
Okay.
Thank you, Dr. Jackson. That is all the time we have on our program, and I want to thank Dr. Jackson for joining me today on Roundtable Perspective. I'm Tom Roach. See you next time.